The sound of a woman being sold like cattle in a frozen frontier town will haunt you forever. $20.
I'm not gonna type.
That's what they
Everyone
wanted
just
for
felt
her
bad.
life, while she stood barefoot in the
KSI
mud.
took it too far.
bruised
I remember
and
I got
silent.
grounded for watching
Most
Sky Does
men
Minecraft
laughed
when I was
and
younger
made
because
their
he cursed too
bids.
much. My mom
One
grounded me
man,
forever.
a mountain trapper who hated
Ugh,
people
what?
more than winter itself.
Yeah, she
threw
grounded
down
the fuck
money
out of
and
me. I was
walked
grounded for
away
like
with
literally
the
over a month.
blizzard should have killed them both.
What the fuck?
What happened next in
Dude,
that
you don't,
isolated
dude, I
town
told you, I
was
spent
seen
all of
by
our
broken
high
souls
school
forever.
and like middle
Stay
school
until the
grounded.
end,
You don't
hit
remember
that
that?
like button and comment your city.
I
So
remember
I
you getting
can
grounded
see
for
how far
watching
this story
AOT.
travels.
I got grounded
The
for
blizzard
AOT,
hit
Sky Does
Black Hollow
Minecraft.
3
I got
hours
grounded
before
because of my
Elias
grades
Crow
every
planned to
semester. I was
He
always
stood
grounded.
outside McCready's trading post, watching the
Starting
sky
beef
turn
with
the
fucking
color of
Dan the
old
Diamond
bruises,
Minecart.
and cursed himself for not heading back
How
to
can
the
you start
mountains
beef
Any of
with-
those YouTubers, like
The
the
wind
Minecraft
already carried
YouTubers.
ice
I always felt like I was
small
too
and
old for
sharp.
them.
The kind that found every gap in a man's coat and
Huh?
reminded him that nature didn't negotiate. His horse stamped nervous hooves
so
in the
behind on
frozen
farm,
mud,
bro.
sensing what was coming. Elias didn't want to go inside. The trading post
Silas
meant
is top
people,
side.
and people meant
You're free
noise,
for dragon if you
questions.
want to get it.
The particular kind of exhaustion
I never
that
watched
came
Dan the
from
Diamond
pretending to
Minecart.
be something he wasn't. But he needed
And
powder,
maybe all this,
salt,
like,
and
2 years
lamp
old,
oil
like,
if he was going to survive the next 3 months alone in
Childish.
his cabin.
Even when I was a kid.
The storm was going to seal the mountain trails for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't a choice. He tied
his
his
van's
horse to
going
the
crit
rail
van.
and pushed through the door. The smell hit him first.
Wait, really?
Unwashed body, tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey.
Who's a part of the
and something
community?
else underneath
No.
it, something sour.
Beijing Canadian Peak.
The trading post was
Sky was my
packed with
goat,
miners,
personally.
prospectors, trappers, all of them driven down
The
from high
prison
country
ones,
by the
where they were like doing the
incoming
prison
storm.
break, that one was peak,
That
bro.
one, I did
Those were
like
fucking
watching
peak,
that.
bro.
Passing bottles and telling
I
lies
did watch
about old
those.
strikes that
I always
never
wanted to
happened.
play that.
Elias kept
Me
his
too.
head down and moved toward the supply counter at the back. He was tall,
Distant
built like someone who'd spent his whole
laughter.
life carrying weight through difficult countries.
You sound like that one guy from South Park doing the poetry.
His face was all hard angles and old scars, the kind that made people look away. That suited him fine.
Smart
"Bro,"
bro.
the clerk grunted, not friendly but not hostile either. "Cutting it close, aren't you? Need powder, 2 pounds of salt, lamp oil." The clerk started pulling items from the shelves behind him. Elias counted out coins on the scarred wooden counter, trying to ignore the noise behind him. Someone was singing badly. Someone else was arguing about a card game. The usual stupidity. Then the door slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows. The entire room went quiet. Rufus Kane stumbled inside, dragging something behind him through the mud. Not something. Someone. A woman, barefoot and thin, her dress torn and filthy, bruises covering her arms and face. She didn't fight him, didn't scream. She just followed, stumbling, like something already dead but still forced to move. Rufus was drunk, swaying on his feet, his coat streaked with mud and worse. Elias had seen him around town, a prospector who'd never found anything worth finding, the kind of man who blamed the world for his own failures. Now he stood in the center of the room, holding the woman's arm in a grip that left white marks on her skin, and he was grinning. "Gentlemen," Rufus announced, his voice too loud, too pleased with itself. "I got something for sale." Nobody moved. The fire crackled. Snow hissed against the windows. "Found her 3 weeks back," Rufus continued, "wandering alone near Copper Ridge. No family, no money, no nothing. I fed her, gave her shelter, took care of her." He yanked her forward. She stumbled but didn't make a sound. "Figure she owes me for that. But I'm a reasonable man. $20 and she's yours. Good worker, keeps quiet. Do whatever you want with her." The woman stood there in the center of the room, head down, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Her feet were bleeding. She was shaking, but Elias couldn't tell if it was from the temperature or something else. Her hair hung in dark tangles across her face, hiding her expression. Someone laughed. One of the miners near the stove. "Hell, Rufus, $20? I can get a good mule for 15. More laughter. Ugly, casual laughter. Elias turned back to the counter, focusing on the items the clerk had laid out. This wasn't his business. This town, these people, none of it had anything to do with him. He'd learned that lesson years ago. You couldn't save everyone. You couldn't save anyone, really. You just survived, alone, and tried not to let the world's cruelty touch you. But his hands wouldn't move to pick up his supplies. $15, someone called out, and not a cent more. 18, another voice countered, but only if she can cook. "Can you cook, girl?" Rufus shook her arm. "Answer the man." The woman's voice came out so quiet Elias almost missed it. Yes. It was the flatness of that word that did it. Not scared, not angry, just empty, like she'd already accepted whatever was coming, because what was the point of fighting? The world was going to do what it wanted anyway. Elias had heard that tone before, in his own voice years ago, when he'd still believed anything mattered. His jaw tightened. He told himself to walk away, take his supplies, get on his horse, ride back into the mountains where things made sense. The storm was coming. He didn't have time for this. 19, someone else said. Final offer. Rufus grinned wider. Now we're talking. Anybody else? Going once, Elias's hand went to his pocket before he could stop it. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, the one that held everything he'd earned from his last 3 months of trapping. His fingers found two $10 bills, creased and soft from handling. $20. Everything he had. He didn't let himself think about it. Thinking meant hesitation, and hesitation meant watching this happen and doing nothing. He'd done that before, watched bad things happen, and told himself it wasn't his problem. He turned around. Everyone was looking at the woman now, evaluating her like livestock. Some faces showed amusement, some showed interest, some showed nothing at all, which was somehow worse. Elias walked forward. The crowd parted for him automatically. People in Black Hollow knew him by reputation, if not by name. The mountain man who kept to himself, who'd once put 2 men in the ground when they tried to steal his winter supplies. Nobody wanted trouble with someone who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself. He stopped in front of Rufus and dropped the $20 into the mud at the prospector's feet. Rufus blinked, then bent down and snatched up the bills, checking them like they might be counterfeit. Well, hell, didn't think the hermit had that kind of money. He looked at Elias, then at the woman, then shrugged. She's yours, Crow. Pleasure doing business. He shoved the woman forward. She stumbled, nearly fell. Elias caught her arm, gently, carefully, because she flinched at the contact like she expected a blow. Up close, he could see the full extent of the damage. The bruises weren't just on her arms. They covered her neck, her collarbone, disappeared under the torn fabric of her dress. One eye was swollen half shut. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but it was her eyes that stopped him. Dark, hollow, and completely empty. Not even afraid anymore. Just waiting. For what? He didn't know. Come on, he said quietly. She followed without a word. The crowd watched them leave. Nobody said anything. Nobody objected. Elias pushed through the door back into the freezing wind, the woman right behind him. His horse stamped and snorted, unhappy about the delay. Elias realized he'd left his supplies on the counter. The powder, the salt, the oil. Everything he'd come to town for. $20 that was supposed to last him through winter, gone. And now he had a half-frozen woman who couldn't even walk properly, and a storm coming that was going to make the mountain trails impossible. This was the stupidest thing he'd ever done. He untied his horse and looked at the woman. She stood there shivering, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "Never learned." "Of course not." Elias swung up into the saddle, then reached down. "Give me your hand." She looked at his hand like it might be a trap. Everything probably felt like a trap to her. But eventually she reached up, and he pulled her up behind him. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and bruises and cold skin. "Hold on to me," he said. "Trail's rough, and it's going to get worse." She hesitated, then wrapped her arms around his waist. He could feel her shaking against his back. The first real gust of wind hit them as they left town. Snow came with it, thick and blinding. Elias pulled his coat tighter and turned the horse toward the mountain trail. He couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. The temperature was dropping fast. Behind him, the woman pressed closer, trying to steal whatever warmth his body offered. He could feel her breath against his back, quick and shallow. "What's your name?" he asked, not sure why it mattered. The wind nearly took her answer. "Mara." "I'm Elias." He urged the horse forward into the white. "We've got about 2 hours to get to the cabin before this storm kills us both. You understand?" "Yes." That was all she said. Yes. Like she'd already decided that dying in a blizzard was just one more thing happening to her, no worse than anything else. The trail climbed steep and treacherous through rock formations that looked like broken teeth. Snow covered everything now, making it hard to tell where solid ground ended and empty air began. Elias knew this path by heart. He'd ridden it hundreds of times in every kind of weather, but even he had trouble finding the markers in the white chaos. The horse struggled, hooves slipping on ice-covered stone. Mara's grip around his waist tightened. Talk to me, Elias said. Need to know you're still conscious. About what? Anything. Silence. Then, I don't know what to say. Where are you from? Ohio, I think. Long time ago. How'd you end up in Colorado? Another long pause. The wind screamed between the rocks. My husband brought me west, said there was gold. There wasn't any gold. What happened to him? Died. Fever. Winter before last. And after? I tried to make it to Denver. Thought I could find work. Didn't make it. Her voice was still flat, reciting facts. Ran out of money in Leadville. Man there said he'd help me. He didn't help me. Elias didn't ask for more details. He could imagine them well enough. They climbed higher. The wind got worse, battering them from all sides, trying to tear them from the saddle. Ice formed on Elias's beard. His hands were going numb despite his gloves. Behind him, Mara had stopped shaking, which was worse than shaking. That meant her body was shutting down. Stay awake, he said. I'm awake. Keep talking. I'm tired. I don't care. Talk. Why did you buy me? The question caught him off guard. He didn't have a good answer. Didn't like what was happening. So now what? You take me to your cabin and do the same thing? There it was. The real question underneath everything else. What did he want from her? What did he expect in return for those $20? No, Elias said. Nothing like that. Then what? I don't know yet. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Honest, at least. The cabin appeared through the snow like a ghost. Elias had built it himself 7 years ago, after he'd decided people weren't worth the trouble anymore. One room, stone fireplace, thick walls, positioned on a shelf of rock that gave a view of the whole valley below. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was sturdy. He dismounted stiffly, muscles screaming from the cold and the ride. Mara tried to get down on her own and nearly fell. Elias caught her, felt her weight against him for a second, then steadied her on her feet. Inside, he said. I'll deal with the horse. She stumbled toward the door. Elias led the horse to the small lean-to he'd built on the side of the cabin, removed the saddle and tack, rubbed the animal down with handfuls of straw. His fingers barely worked. When he finally got back inside, Mara was standing exactly where she'd stopped, just inside the door, dripping melted snow onto the floor. The cabin was freezing. Elias went to the fireplace and started building a fire from kindling and split logs. His hand shook so bad it took 3 tries to get the flint to catch. Eventually, flames started to grow, spreading heat that would take hours to warm the whole space. He looked at Mara. She hadn't moved. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said. She flinched. I'm not... Elias stopped, tried again. You're going to freeze to death standing there. There's a blanket on the bed, strip down, wrap yourself in it, get close to the fire. I'll turn around. She didn't move. Mara, I'm trying to keep you alive, that's all. Finally, slowly, she nodded. Elias turned his back to her and focused on the fire, feeding it more wood, building it up strong. Behind him, he heard the wet sounds of fabric being removed, the soft padding of bare feet on wood, the rustle of a blanket. Okay, she said quietly. He turned around. She sat on the floor near the fire, wrapped in his heaviest wool blanket, her wet clothes in a pile beside her. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face. She was still shivering, but at least she was warming up. Elias went to the corner where he kept his food supplies. Not much left. Some dried meat, beans, flour, coffee. He'd been planning to restock in town before winter hit. That hadn't worked out. He put a pot of water on the fire to boil and threw in some jerky and beans. It wouldn't be good, but it would be hot. While that cooked, he found a shirt and pants of his own, way too big for her, but clean and dry. Here, he said, setting them beside her. Put these on when you're ready. She looked at the clothes like they might bite her. Why are you helping me? Because you need help. Nobody helps without wanting something back. Elias sat down across the fire from her, far enough away that she didn't have to feel crowded. Maybe I'm just tired of watching bad things happen. That's not a reason. It's the only one I've got. She studied him through the flames, trying to figure out what kind of man he was, trying to figure out what this was going to cost her. He could see the calculations in her eyes, all the terrible possibilities running through her mind. The water started to boil. Elias stirred the pot, tasted the thin soup, added some salt. It wasn't good, but it was better than nothing. He poured some into a tin cup and handed it to her. Careful, it's hot. She took it with both hands, holding it like it was precious. She sipped carefully, then closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside, shaking the cabin walls, screaming through gaps in the wood. The fire crackled and popped. Mara finished the soup and set the cup down. She was still wrapped in the blanket, still shivering a little, but some color had returned to her face. Where do I sleep? She asked. Elias pointed to the bed in the corner. There. Where do you sleep? Floor's fine, got plenty of blankets. She looked at him like he was speaking a language she didn't understand. You're giving me the bed. It's warmer. You need it more than I do. And you want nothing from me. I already told you that. Men always want something. Elias felt anger rise in his chest, but not at her. At whatever had broken her enough to believe that. At Rufus Kane and all the others like him, at a world that let this happen over and over until a woman couldn't even accept kindness without suspecting a trap. Not this man, he said quietly. Not tonight. Not ever. You understand? She didn't answer right away. Just sat there, wrapped in his blanket, studying his face like she was trying to find the lie. Eventually, she nodded, but he could tell she didn't believe him. Not really. She'd believe it when she saw it, maybe. Or maybe she'd never believe it. Time would tell. Get some sleep, Elias said. Storm's going to last a few days at least. You're safe here. Mara stood up slowly, still clutching the blanket around herself, and walked to the bed. She lay down on top of the covers, curled into a tight ball, watching him. Elias spread his own blankets near the fire and lay down with his back to her, giving her privacy, giving her space. The floor was hard and cold, but he'd slept in worse places. Outside, the blizzard hammered the mountain like it was trying to shake them loose. Inside, the fire slowly died down to embers, casting strange shadows on the walls. Elias closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. He kept thinking about those $20, about the supplies he'd left behind, about the long winter ahead with half the resources he'd needed. Kept thinking about the woman in his bed who didn't trust him and probably shouldn't. Kept thinking about what the hell he was supposed to do now. He didn't have answers. Somewhere in the darkness, he heard Mara's breathing change, becoming deeper, slower. She'd fallen asleep finally. At least one of them could. Elias lay awake listening to the storm destroy the world outside and wondered what kind of man threw away everything he had for a stranger. Wondered if it was nobility or stupidity or something else entirely. Wondered what would happen when morning came and they had to figure out how two broken people were supposed to share a space neither of them wanted to share with anyone. The fire crackled, the wind screamed, and somewhere in the middle of the worst blizzard the mountain had seen in years, two people who'd given up on the world found themselves trapped together in a cabin barely big enough for one. Morning would bring answers, or more problems. Probably more problems. But for now, they were both still alive, and maybe that was enough. The morning light came through the single window, pale and weak, barely cutting through the white haze of falling snow. Elias woke to the sound of movement, quick, nervous, the kind of sound a trapped animal makes testing the bars of its cage. He opened his eyes. Mara was already awake, already dressed in the oversized clothes he'd given her, already moving through the cabin like she was trying to be invisible. She'd rolled up the sleeves of his shirt so many times they looked like cuffs, and his pants pooled around her ankles. She'd tied them at the waist with a piece of twine from his supplies. She looked small and fragile and terrified, but she was moving with purpose. She was scrubbing the floor. Not just scrubbing, attacking it. Her hands were raw and bleeding where she'd scraped them on the rough stone, but she kept going, using an old brush he kept for cleaning the hearth, working in frantic circular motions like she was trying to erase something that couldn't be erased. Elias sat up slowly. His back was stiff from sleeping on the hard floor, and his fingers were still half numb from the cold. He watched her for a moment without saying anything, trying to understand what he was looking at. Mara. She jumped like he'd grabbed her. The brush fell from her bleeding hands, clattering on the stone. She spun around, eyes wide, body already braced for something. Don't, she started. Stop, Elias said, keeping his voice level. You're hurting yourself. She looked down at her hands like she'd forgotten they were attached to her body. Blood dripped from her fingertips onto the floor she'd just scrubbed clean. Her expression didn't change. She just stared at the blood like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Elias stood up slowly, being careful to move deliberately so she wouldn't think he was coming at her. He walked to the corner where he kept his medical supplies, bandages, salve, clean cloth, and brought them back to where she was standing. Sit, he said, pointing to the chair by the table. She didn't move. Sit down, Mara. I need to look at your hands. Something in his tone must have sounded non-negotiable because she moved to the chair and sat down. She held her hands out in front of her like they belonged to someone else, like she was offering them for inspection. Elias took the bucket of water he'd melted from snow and started cleaning the blood away. Underneath, her hands were worse than the blood suggested. The skin was scraped raw, bleeding in multiple places, the nails torn and broken. And her feet, when he finally got around to looking at those, he had to stop himself from making a sound. The frostbite from yesterday had gotten worse during the night. Her toes were swollen and darkening, the skin cracked and blistering. Infection was already starting to set in. How long were you outside? He asked. Outside where? Before Rufus found you. Mara's eyes went distant. 3 days? 4. I wasn't counting. In winter gear? Just what I had on. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. 3 or 4 days wandering in the mountains with no proper clothes in the middle of winter. The fact that she was alive at all was a miracle. The fact that she could still walk was impossible. He worked carefully, cleaning away the dead skin, applying salve, wrapping her feet in clean cloth. She watched him the whole time, never speaking, never moving, just watching like she was trying to memorize his face, like she was trying to figure out what came next. When he finished with her feet, he went back to her hands. There wasn't much he could do except clean them and wrap them. The damage was done. Why were you scrubbing? He asked while he worked. The floor was dirty. It was fine. It wasn't. I could see where I'd walked, where I'd bled. I needed to clean it. Elias tied off the last bandage. You were trying to erase yourself. She didn't deny it, just looked at her wrapped hands like they were foreign objects. This isn't about the floor, Elias said. You're thinking you owe me something, that because I bought you, you need to pay back the debt. Don't I? No. Everyone says that at first, then they want payment. Elias sat back on his heels, trying to figure out how to say this in a way she might actually hear. I didn't bring you up here to own you, Mara. I didn't bring you here to use you or work you or expect anything from you except that you stay alive. That's all. Why? Because I couldn't watch it happen any longer. That's not a reason. That's just something you say. Elias stood up, frustrated, running his hand through his hair. He went to the window and looked out at the white world. The snow was still falling hard, the wind still howling around the corners of the cabin. They were trapped here, the two of them, and she believed with absolute certainty that he was going to hurt her eventually. That this kindness was just the setup for cruelty. That everything had a price, and she was eventually going to have to pay it. He understood where that belief came from. He understood it all too well. My father was a hard man, Elias said quietly, not turning around. Worked people until they broke, then threw them out and found new ones. I watched him do it to my mother, watched him do it to workers. When I got old enough, I told him I wouldn't be like him. We fought about it. He said I was soft, weak, that the world would destroy me because I couldn't be cruel. And he was right about one thing. The world did destroy me. Just took a different path than he expected. But I learned something from watching him destroy other people. Every single time he did it, something inside him died too. He got meaner and colder because he was trying to kill something in himself that wouldn't die. He finally turned to look at her. I'm not trying to own you. I'm trying to not become him. Mara looked at her wrapped hands. That's not fair. What's not fair? Using your sadness to prove you're not like your father. That's not fair. Elias actually laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. No, it's not. You're right. Nothing about this is fair. I'm a selfish man living alone on a mountain because I can't handle other people. And somehow I've ended up with you, and I'm terrified of screwing this up because every instinct I have tells me to push you away before you disappoint me. She looked up at him then, and there was something different in her eyes. Not trust yet, but maybe recognition. Maybe the understanding that he was as broken as she was, just in different ways. I need you to understand something, he continued. The reason I'm not like my father isn't because I'm good. It's because I'm a coward. I'd rather live alone than risk hurting someone. I'd rather push the world away than be part of it. So no, I'm not expecting anything from you, because I don't know how to want anything from anyone. Mara was quiet for a long time. Outside, the blizzard hammered against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, the only sound besides the wind. What do you want me to do? She finally asked. Right now? Rest. Your feet need time to heal. Your hands need to stop bleeding. And after? After we figure it out as we go, one day at a time. She nodded slowly, like she was considering whether to believe him. She held up her hands, looking at the bandages. I can't cook like this. You don't need to cook. I need to do something. I need to earn my place here. You earn it by being alive, by surviving. That's enough. She shook her head. It's not. I know how this works. Nobody gives anything for free. Elias felt the weight of years of cruelty in those words, and he didn't have a good answer for it. How could he convince her that the world sometimes offered grace? That not every transaction ended in pain? The truth was, he couldn't. She would have to figure that out on her own. Over the next few days, Mara tested him in small ways. She'd watch him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying his face for signs of anger or impatience. She'd flinch if he moved too quickly. She'd pull away from proximity like his touch might burn her, and she'd try to do things. She tried to cook despite her injured hands, grabbing the cast iron pot with wrapped fingers that couldn't bend properly. Elias found her holding it against her body, the weight clearly causing pain, refusing to let him take it. Mara, let go. I can do this. I'm not asking. Let go. When he finally pried it from her grip and set it down, he saw tears on her face. Not from the pain in her hands, but from something deeper, something that said the thought of being useless was worse than physical suffering. You're not here to earn your keep, he said. You're here to heal. Healing is for people who have something to heal toward. I don't have anywhere to go, Elias. Nobody wants me. I'm not worth anything. They were standing in the cabin in the pale light of afternoon, snow still falling outside like the world was never going to be white again, like winter was eternal. Elias looked at this woman who had been sold for $20 and treated like livestock, and he made a decision that would echo through everything that came after. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he gently took her chin in his hand and tilted her face up toward his. Listen to me, he said. Your worth was never about what you could do or who wanted you. Your worth is just that you exist, that you're a person with a mind and a heart and a will of your own. The fact that you survived out there in the snow, the fact that you're still breathing, the fact that you keep trying even though you believe everything is hopeless, that makes you valuable. Not because you can cook or clean or work, because you're alive. She was crying then, openly, tears running down her face, her breath coming in short gasps like she'd been holding everything in and could finally afford to let it out. Nobody ever said that to me before, she whispered. Then they were all wrong. He didn't hold her because he sensed she wasn't ready for that. But he didn't let her go either. He kept his hand on her face until her breathing steadied, until the tears slowed, until some of the tension drained from her shoulders. Over the next week, the cabin stopped feeling like a prison. The change was gradual, so slow Elias almost didn't notice it happening, until one morning he woke up and didn't immediately think of himself as a prisoner. Mara's feet were healing. The swelling had gone down. The infection was fading. Her hands were still wrapped, but she was learning to do small things. Pick up things carefully, move around the cabin without flinching at every noise. And she was starting to talk. Not much. And not about anything deep, but talk. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about a brother who'd died in the war, about her husband Samuel, who'd promised her the world and delivered only winter and disappointment. She told him about Leadville, about the man who'd promised her work and given her degradation instead. She told him about the 3 days wandering in the snow, about thinking she was going to die, about the strange absence of fear when you realize death might actually be a mercy. Elias shared things too, things he hadn't told another person in years. Stories about his father, stories about the first people he'd hurt, The first time he realized he had the capacity for real violence. Stories about why he'd chosen solitude, about the peace of never having to face disappointment because he'd cut himself off from everyone who might disappoint him. One evening, near the end of the second week, Mara was sitting by the fire trying to mend one of his shirts with fingers that still struggled to cooperate. The needle kept slipping, and she kept trying anyway, her jaw set with determination. "Let me," Elias said. "I need to learn." "You will, but your hands aren't ready yet." She handed him the shirt without arguing, which told him something had shifted in how she thought about him. Trust maybe, or at least the first tentative steps toward it. He worked the needle through the fabric while she watched, asking questions about his technique, about how he'd learned to sew. He told her his mother had taught him, that his father thought it was emasculating, that his mother had done it anyway because she said every man should know how to care for himself. "She sounds like she was strong," Mara said. She was, but strength didn't save her. When my father decided he was done with her, he was done. She didn't have anywhere to go, just like you. No family who'd take her in, no money of her own. She died in a city I never found out the name of, working until her body gave out. "That's terrible." "That's the world," Elias said, but not unkindly. "That's why I don't trust it. That's why I live alone." "But you don't live alone anymore?" He looked at her, really looked at her. The bruises were mostly gone now. Her face was starting to fill out from the regular meals. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of it. "No," he agreed. "I don't." 3 weeks into her recovery, Mara woke before dawn and made breakfast by herself. It wasn't good. The biscuits were hard as rocks and the coffee was too strong. But she'd done it. She'd moved through the cabin with purpose, not like someone trying to be invisible, but like someone who belonged in the space. Elias woke to the smell of burnt flour and nearly smiled. He sat up and found her watching him from the other side of the fire, nervous, waiting for his judgment. "You cooked," he said. "I tried." He got up and examined the breakfast. The biscuits were definitely the worst thing he'd ever eaten. The coffee was punishing. The eggs were actually pretty good. He ate everything without complaint and told her it was fine. "It was terrible," she said. "It was, but you made it, and you're learning. That's what matters." "Is that enough?" she asked, and he heard the real question underneath. "Am I enough? Will I ever be enough?" "It's enough," he said. "For now, it's enough." That afternoon, Elias needed to go out and work on the cabin's outer wall where the chinking had come loose. Mara insisted on helping despite her still healing hands. He set up a small task she could do, preparing fresh mud and grass mixture for patching, and he worked on the wall while she worked on the mixture. The day was cold but clear. The snow temporarily stopped, the sun reflecting bright off the white landscape. It was the kind of day that reminded you the world was beautiful when it wasn't trying to kill you. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said while she worked. "Of course." "That man, Rufus, do you think he's going to come looking for me?" Elias didn't lie to her. "Probably. Men like that don't let go of things they think they own." "What will you do?" "Protect you." She stopped working. "How?" "I don't know yet, but I will." He meant it absolutely, and something in his voice must have conveyed that because she nodded and went back to mixing mud. As the sun started to set, painting the snow orange and pink, Mara stood beside him looking out at the valley below. The mountains stretched away in all directions, endless and indifferent, beautiful and harsh. "I never thought I'd feel safe anywhere," she said quietly. "Are you safe here?" "I think so. Yes. Good." They stood like that as the light died, as shadows crept across the white landscape, as the temperature started to drop and the world prepared for another freezing night. And for the first time since Elias had pulled her from that trading post, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this broken thing they'd started building together had a chance of lasting. The cabin door was behind them, warm light spilling out from the windows. Inside, the fire would be dying down, needing wood. Tomorrow there would be more work, more small moments of learning to trust, more tests to pass. But tonight, standing in the dying light with a woman who'd stopped believing in mercy until he'd shown her some, Elias allowed himself the dangerous thought that perhaps the world wasn't quite as cruel as he'd always believed. Perhaps there were second chances. Perhaps they weren't always a trap. Perhaps they were real. That dangerous thought about second chances lasted exactly 11 days before the world came to collect on it. Elias was splitting firewood when he heard it, the sound of hooves on the frozen trail below the cabin, moving slow and deliberate like men who weren't in a hurry because they knew their destination. He stopped mid-swing, axe hanging in the air, and listened. 2 horses, maybe. Moving up through the rock formations, he'd learned to use as a natural alarm system. Sound carried strange up here, bounced between stone faces in ways that gave you warning before you could see anything. He set the axe down quietly against the woodpile and went inside. Mara was at the table working on a second attempt at biscuits, having declared war on the recipe after the first batch turned out like river stones. Flour dusted her forearms. She looked up when he came in and read his face immediately. "What's wrong?" "Riders on the trail, 2, maybe 3. She went very still. The color drained out of her face in a way that told him everything he needed to know about who she thought it was. "Could be travelers," she said, but her voice had gone flat and careful, the way it used to sound when she first arrived, like she was already retreating back inside herself, preparing for something. "Could be," Elias agreed, not believing it. He moved to the corner where he kept his rifle, checked the load, then checked the revolver on his belt. Mara watched him do this with eyes that had gotten very wide and very dark. "Elias, I hear you. What if it's him?" He looked at her. "Then I deal with it. He'll have men with him. He had a partner in Black Hollow, a man named Cutter Briggs. Briggs carries a rifle, and he's shot people before." "How do you know that?" "Because Rufus told me." Her voice cracked slightly. "He told me a lot of things about what would happen if I tried to run. He liked describing it." Elias felt the anger move through him like a cold current, starting deep in his chest and spreading outward. He'd felt it before. This particular kind of fury that came not from anything done to him personally, but from witnessing cruelty done to someone who had no protection. He'd spent years suppressing it, telling himself it wasn't his business, that he couldn't fix the world. He looked at the door, then back at Mara. "Get away from the window," he said. "Go to the back corner and stay there. Don't come out until I tell you. Elias, Mara, go." She went, flowers still on her hands, wiping them on the cloth at her waist with the automatic gesture of someone whose hands needed something to do. Elias stepped outside. The day was sharp and cold, the sky a hard clear blue that made everything look precise and bright. New snow from 2 nights ago covered the yard in white, undisturbed, except for where Elias had walked to the woodpile. The trail came up from the left, winding through a stand of bare pines before it opened into the yard. He could hear them clearly now, close. Elias stood in the center of the yard, hands loose at his sides, and waited. Rufus Kane came through the trees first. He looked worse than he had in Black Hollow, thinner, meaner, his coat patched in 3 places and his face dark with weeks of stubble. His eyes found Elias, and something ugly moved across his face. Behind him came a second man, larger, on a gray horse. Cutter Briggs. He carried a Winchester rifle across the pommel of his saddle with the easy familiarity of a man who'd used it often and expected to use it again. He had a round face and pale eyes that moved constantly, evaluating everything, finding angles. They pulled up their horses in the yard and looked down at Elias. "Crow," Rufus said. "Kane. Didn't figure you for the company type." "I'm not." Rufus let that sit for a moment, then swung down from his horse. Briggs stayed mounted, which was the smart play, higher ground, better angle. Elias noted it without reacting. "I'll be direct," Rufus said, coming forward 3 steps and stopping. "I need money. Storm took everything I had stored down in my camp. Lost my equipment, my food, damn near lost my partner here." He nodded at Briggs. "I remember you throwing down $20 back in town for the girl. Figure a man who can spend 20 on a whim has more where that came from." "You figure wrong." "That's so?" Rufus looked around the yard, at the cabin, at the lean-to with the horse inside. "Looks like a man doing all right to me. Good cabin, good stock." "It's a working cabin, nothing more." "I want $50, Rufus said, his tone shifting to something harder. "Or the girl back. Either way, I'm leaving with something today." Elias heard the words and felt absolutely no surprise. This was always how it was going to end. He'd known it when he'd thrown down the $20, maybe even before that, when he'd first heard Rufus's voice in the trading post. "She's not yours," Elias said. She was never yours. You don't own her, and you never did. I fed her, kept her alive. Man who keeps a thing alive owns it. Rufus's voice turned petulant, defensive, like a child explaining why he had the right to something that didn't belong to him. That's how it works out here, Crow. You ought to know that. That's not how it works anywhere. Fine. Rufus's jaw tightened. $50. That's all I'm asking. $50 and I ride away and you never see me again. Reasonable, considering. Elias looked at him steadily. No. Silence. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the yard. Briggs shifted on his horse, the Winchester coming up a little from the pommel. That's your answer? Rufus said. That's my answer. Rufus looked at Briggs. Some communication passed between them. The silent language of men who'd worked together long enough to know each other's intentions without speaking them. Briggs brought the rifle up. What happened next happened faster than thinking aloud for. Rufus lunged forward at the same moment Briggs raised the Winchester, and Elias moved sideways, not back, sideways, because a man who steps back is already losing. He drove his shoulder into Rufus's chest as the prospector came at him, felt the impact, used it, turned Rufus's own momentum to throw him sideways into the snow. The rifle cracked. The shot went wide, chewing snow and dirt 6 feet to Elias's left. Briggs's horse spooked at the sound, dancing sideways, disrupting his second shot. Elias had his revolver out by then, had it aimed at Briggs before the man could get the animal under control. Drop it, Elias said. Briggs stopped moving. His pale eyes calculated. I will not ask a second time, Elias said. The Winchester lowered, but Briggs didn't drop it. Just lowered it, which was the smallest concession possible without surrendering. Behind Elias, Rufus was already getting up from the snow, cursing, scrabbling for something at his belt. Elias heard the sound, turned, saw the knife coming up. A heavy skinning knife, 8 inches of blade, and stepped to the inside of the swing instead of away from it. The knife grazed his left arm, felt like fire. Elias grabbed Rufus's wrist with his free hand, twisted it hard until he felt something pop, and heard Rufus cry out. The knife fell into the snow. Elias released the wrist and put his elbow into Rufus's face, once, hard. Rufus went down again and this time stayed down, sitting in the snow with his hands over his face, blood streaming between his fingers. Elias turned back to Briggs. The rifle was up again. There was no time to think about it, no time to weigh options or consider alternatives. Elias was already moving, already diving to the side, when the shot cracked through the cold air. He felt the bullet as a line of heat across his left shoulder, not the deep tearing pain of a proper hit, but the burning scrape of a near miss, close enough to know it had grazed him. He hit the snow and rolled, came up behind the woodpile. Not as much cover as he wanted, but better than nothing. His shoulder was bleeding. He could feel it now, a sharp, insistent pain that was going to get worse once the cold wore off. Briggs was trying to reload, working the lever action on the Winchester, but his horse was still spooked and fighting him. Rufus was on his knees in the snow, looking for the knife. Elias steadied his revolver against the top log of the woodpile. Briggs, last warning. Briggs got the rifle levered and started to raise it again. The shot from the cabin porch changed everything. It was loud, louder than Elias's revolver, the deep boom of his second rifle, the one he kept mounted above the door. He kept it loaded. He'd never expected to need it for this. Rufus Kane crumpled face first into the snow and didn't move. Elias's eyes snapped to the cabin porch. Mara stood there with both hands wrapped around the rifle stock, the barrel still smoking in the cold air. She was barefoot on the frozen porch boards. She was wearing his oversized shirt and the pants tied with twine. Her face was completely white. Her hands were not shaking. Briggs stared at Rufus's body, then at Mara, then at Elias. The calculation in his pale eyes ran fast. One man behind cover with a revolver, one woman on the porch who just killed a man without hesitating. And whatever conclusions he reached, they came out decisively in favor of leaving. He wheeled his horse and drove his heels in hard, the animal bolting back through the pines and down the mountain trail. The sound of hooves hammered away into the distance until the mountain swallowed it entirely. Elias stayed behind the woodpile for another full minute, listening, making sure Briggs wasn't coming back around. Then he stood up. He looked at Rufus Kane lying motionless in the snow, the dark stain spreading slowly beneath him. He looked at the cabin porch where Mara still stood, the rifle in her hand, staring at the body. Elias walked across the yard to the porch steps. Mara. She didn't look at him. Mara, look at me. She dragged her eyes away from Rufus and looked at Elias. There was something strange in her expression, not shock exactly, not guilt exactly, something complicated and hard to name. I told you to stay in the corner, he said. Yes, she agreed. You did. Why didn't you? Because you were going to die. Her voice was steady but thin. He had the rifle and you were in the open and there was nothing between you and that shot except luck. The rifle was above the door. I've been watching you take it down every morning to check it. I knew it was loaded. Elias looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who'd come up his mountain in rags, bleeding and broken, who'd spent the first weeks in his cabin waiting for punishment and making herself invisible and trying to scrub her own existence from his floors. You've never shot a man before, he said. No. How are you feeling? She thought about it seriously. I don't know yet. That's honest. I'm not sorry, she said, and he could tell she was listening to her own words as she said them, testing them for truth. I know I should probably feel sorry, but I don't. He would have killed you, and then he would have taken me, and I wasn't going to let that happen. The last sentence came out differently from the rest. Harder, more certain. Like something she'd decided in the moment and was only now fully understanding the weight of. You had a choice, Elias said. Yes, you could have stayed in that corner. Yes. But you didn't. No, she said. I didn't. Elias became aware then that his shoulder was bleeding in earnest, the warmth of it soaking through his shirt and into his coat, turning the wool dark. He became aware because his left arm suddenly felt very heavy and wrong. You're hit, Mara said. Grazed. It's not deep. Come inside. I need to deal with... He gestured toward Rufus. He's not going anywhere. You're bleeding. Come inside. There was authority in her voice. Not harsh, not demanding, but firm in a way he hadn't heard from her before. Not asking. Telling. He went inside. She sat him down at the table and went for the medical supplies with the same directness she'd just used to tell him what to do. She moved around the cabin without hesitation, finding what she needed, boiling water, tearing clean cloth into strips. Take the coat off, she said. He worked the coat off slowly, jaw tight against the pain. The shirt underneath was soaked red from shoulder to mid-back on the left side. Mara cut the shirt away without asking, exposing the wound. He heard her breath catch. How bad? He asked. The bullet grazed you along the top of the shoulder, cut through muscle. It's deep enough to need stitching. Are you going to handle stitches? I've handled stitches before. I've never given them. There's a needle in the sewing kit. Thread it with the strongest thread you can find. She went and got it. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She moved with purpose, hands steady, face set with concentration. She'd just killed a man on his behalf, and now she was threading a needle, and she was shaking less than he was. You're going to have to do exactly what I tell you, Elias said, or it'll get infected and I'll lose the arm. Worst case, I die. So you need to listen. I'm listening. He walked her through it step by step. How to clean the wound properly, even though it was going to hurt like something was on fire. How to pull the edges together. How to space the stitches so the wound would close evenly. Mara did every step without argument, asking questions when she didn't understand, adjusting when he corrected her. He bit down on a leather strap when the needle went in. He did not make a sound. 3 times the world went gray at the edges, and 3 times he pulled himself back. When it was done, Mara tied off the thread and wrapped the wound in clean cloth, then stepped back and looked at her work. Her hands had a fine tremor now that the focus had broken, the delayed reaction to everything that had happened. She sat down hard in the other chair. Don't you dare faint, Elias said. She actually laughed, short, surprised, slightly wild. I'm not going to faint. Good. Are you going to faint? No. A pause. Probably not. She laughed again, and this time it lasted longer, and somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted over into something that wasn't quite laughing, and she put her hands over her face for a moment and breathed through it until she came back. Tell me what to do next, she said when her hands came down. Rufus needs to be dealt with. Ground's too frozen to bury him. I'll deal with it. Elias stared at her. Mara, you're not dragging a body with that shoulder. Tell me what needs to be done and I'll do it. He told her. She went outside and did it, and she didn't ask him to do it for her, and she didn't come back in until it was handled. When she returned, her face was pale and her jaw was set, and she went directly to the wash basin and cleaned her hands very thoroughly, and Elias didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. She dried her hands and sat back down across from him. Briggs is going to come back, Elias said. I know. He might bring more men. I know that too. This cabin is defensible. One entrance on each side, good sight lines from the front window. But if he comes back with 5 men, that's a different calculation. Mara looked at the rifle she'd propped against the wall after bringing it back inside. Then we'd better be ready before he can do that. The we landed between them like a fact. Not discussed, not negotiated. Just stated, as if it were obvious, which maybe it was. The fire needed wood. Elias moved to get up, and Mara stopped him with a hand on his good arm. Sit, she said. I've got it. She brought in wood from the porch, stacked it by the fire, built it up until the heat filled the cabin. She made coffee, strong the way he liked it, and set a cup in front of him. She made soup from what they had, moving through the kitchen space with more confidence than she'd shown even yesterday, like something had shifted in how she understood what she was capable of. They ate in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The fire crackled. Outside, the evening was settling in and the temperature was dropping fast. Why did you come up here? Mara asked eventually. She wasn't looking at him, watching the fire instead. To the mountain, I mean, before all this. I told you, I can't handle people. But why really? Something must have happened. Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, feeling the warmth through his palms. My wife, he said. Mara looked at him. Her name was Clara. She died. Fever, same as your husband, same as takes everyone out here eventually. She was 26. He paused. When she died, I couldn't be around anyone who knew her. Everyone who saw me saw her absence. I couldn't carry that and carry myself too. So I came up here where nobody knew either of us. How long ago? 8 years. You've been alone 8 years. It was easier. Easier than what? Than caring about anyone. Than watching someone else die. Than being the person left behind again. Mara was quiet for a while. That's why you paid for me, she said finally. Not just because you hated watching it happen. Because you knew what it was to be treated like you didn't matter. Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about Clara. About the way grief had felt like a physical weight those first years. About the slow calcification of his heart that he'd mistaken for healing. About the morning he'd woken up and realized he hadn't felt anything in so long he'd forgotten what it was like to try. Maybe, he said. You don't have to make it sound like a mystery, Mara said, not unkindly. You were lonely and you did something reckless because of it. That's human. I'm not sure reckless covers buying a woman from a drunk prospector. No, but it's a start. She almost smiled. Almost. Clara sounds like she was someone worth grieving. She was. Do you still? Grieve her? Yes. He considered it. I think I used to grieve her and stopped halfway through, and I've been carrying around the half-grief ever since. Like a wound that closed over wrong and never properly healed. I know what that feels like, Mara said quietly. Grief that you never finished. Your husband. No, myself. She turned back to the fire. I started grieving myself a long time ago, piece by piece. Every time something was taken, I'd grieve that piece and put it away and tell myself that was just how it was. By the time Rufus found me, I'd already buried most of what I was. She paused. I'm trying to dig it back up. The fire snapped and a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind picked up, moving through the pines with a sound like breathing. Elias looked at this woman sitting across the fire from him, this woman who'd been sold for $20 and had just killed a man to save his life, and was now sitting calmly eating soup and talking about grief with more clarity than he'd managed in 8 years of mountain solitude. He'd come up here to get away from people, to stop feeling things, to make himself small enough that the world couldn't find anything worth hurting. He'd been doing a remarkable job of it, right up until he walked into McCready's trading post on the wrong afternoon. You shot a man today, he said, not as an accusation, just acknowledging what it was. Yes. First time you've ever done something like that. First time I've ever done anything like that. And you're still here. You didn't fall apart. She looked at him directly. Is that surprising? Honestly, yes. Why? Because a month ago you were scrubbing this floor with bleeding hands, trying to make yourself small enough to ignore. And today you came out on that porch with a rifle and made a decision most men I know couldn't make. Mara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and considered, like she was working out what she believed as she said it. When I saw you get hit, she said, something happened in my head. Like a door that had always been locked suddenly opened. And behind the door wasn't rage exactly, it was just clarity. Very simple, very clear. I wasn't going to let him kill you. That's all there was to it. Everything else disappeared except that one clear fact. That's what it feels like, Elias said. What? Deciding to protect something, someone. She held his gaze for a moment. Is that what you felt? When you threw the money down in Black Hollow? He thought about it. About the moment the two $10 bills had hit the dirt. About the absolute absence of hesitation. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it felt like. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. They didn't need to. The fire burned low and steady. The wind worked through the night outside. Somewhere deep in the mountain, something shifted and settled, the way rock does when weight redistributes slowly and irreversibly. Elias's shoulder ached with a dull, persistent intensity that told him the real pain was coming, that tomorrow would be worse than today, that he was going to be functionally useless for at least 2 weeks while the wound closed. He was going to need help. He looked across the fire at Mara, who was watching the flames with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between exhaustion and something new, something that didn't have a name yet because it had only just arrived. Asking for help had never come easily to him. 8 years of solitude had turned self-sufficiency from a skill into a religion. But the shoulder was real, and the pain was real, and Briggs was out there somewhere with reasons to come back, and Winter still had months left to run. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I'm going to need you to do most of the outside work for the next couple of weeks, he said. Firewood, water, checking the horse. My shoulder won't take it. Mara looked at him. She understood what it had cost him to say that. He could tell from the way she didn't make a thing of it. All right, she said simply. That was it. No ceremony. No acknowledgement of what it meant that Elias Crow, who hadn't needed anyone in 8 years, had just admitted he needed something. She just said all right and went back to watching the fire, and somewhere in that simple acceptance was something more profound than either of them could have articulated. The night deepened around the cabin. The fire needed feeding again. Mara got up and put 2 more logs on without being asked, and Elias watched her move through the orange light with the ease of someone who'd started to belong in a space, not just occupying it, but inhabiting it, which were 2 entirely different things. He thought about Briggs riding down the mountain in the dark, cold and furious, and making plans. Thought about what would happen when that man decided he had enough men and enough anger to come back up. The cabin was defensible. They had weapons and ammunition, and the high ground and the advantage of knowing the terrain. They had supplies for at least another 6 weeks. They had each other. He hadn't expected to find that worth anything, hadn't expected to discover, here on the side of a mountain at the end of a terrible day, that the presence of another person, the right person, could feel less like vulnerability and more like armor. His shoulder was on fire. His hands were cold. Outside, Winter had them locked in tight, and somewhere below a dangerous man was planning his return. But the fire was burning, and the soup was gone, and Mara Vale was alive and whole, and sitting across from him with new light in her eyes. And Elias Crow, who had not allowed himself to need anything in 8 years, fell asleep in his chair by the fire without meaning to, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt safe enough to. He woke to the sound of Mara adding wood to the fire and pretended for a moment that he hadn't fallen asleep in the chair like an old man. It didn't work. She'd clearly been watching him sleep because when he opened his eyes, she was already looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. How long? He asked. Few hours. It's past midnight. Elias tried to sit up straighter and regretted it immediately. The shoulder had stiffened during sleep, the wound tightening into a deep, persistent ache that ran from his neck down to his elbow. He'd had worse. He'd also had better. He set his jaw and breathed through it until the initial wave passed. "You should sleep in the bed," Mara said. "You can't heal sitting up." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're pale and you've been bleeding through the bandage for the last hour." He looked down at his shoulder. She was right. The cloth wrapping had soaked through on the outer edge, a dark stain spreading slow and steady, not gushing, but consistent enough to be a problem. "I need to rewrap it," she said. "Come to the table." He moved to the table, lowering himself into the chair with deliberate care. Mara unwound the old bandage, examined the wound in the firelight with the focused expression she'd had while stitching him earlier, then started cleaning and rewrapping with clean cloth. "It pulled open in 2 places," she said. "I'm going to put 2 more stitches in." "You don't have to ask permission." "I wasn't asking. I was warning you." He almost smiled at that. He bit down on the leather strap again and let her work. She was faster this time, more confident in what she was doing. Still not painless, still not easy, but competent in a way that surprised him. Or maybe it didn't surprise him anymore. "Where did Briggs go?" she asked while she tied off the last stitch. "Down the mountain, probably Black Hollow." "How long before he comes back?" "Depends on whether he can find men willing to ride up a mountain in winter for a grudge that isn't theirs. Could be a few days, could be longer. Could be never?" Elias considered it. "No. Men like Briggs don't let things go. It's not in their nature. He watched his partner die. He's going to want something for that, even if it takes time." Mara finished the wrapping and sat back. "Then we should use the time." "For what?" "For getting ready, improving the cabin's defenses, making sure we're not caught off guard like today." Elias looked at her. A month ago, she'd been scrubbing blood from her hands in his cabin, convinced she owed him everything, convinced she was worth nothing. Now she was sitting across from him in the middle of the night talking about defensive strategy, like it was a practical problem to be solved, which it was. "You're different," he said. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Something changed today. When I came out on that porch, I could feel it happening, like ice breaking up in spring. Something that had been frozen for a long time just cracked open. Not something bad. No, something I thought was dead." She paused. "I thought the part of me that was willing to fight for something was gone. Beaten out over too many years. I thought I was only good at surviving, not at deciding what was worth surviving for. And now?" She met his eyes steadily. "Now I know what I'm surviving for." Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving a brittle quiet over the mountain. The fire settled into steady warmth. Elias's shoulder throbbed in rhythmic waves, and the tiredness was bone deep, but his mind was running clear and sharp despite everything. Over the next 3 days, while his shoulder slowly began the painful work of healing, Mara ran the outside operation of the cabin with a methodical efficiency that would have impressed him even if he hadn't known where she'd come from. She split firewood in clean, precise strokes, learning quickly to let the weight of the axe do the work rather than fighting it. She managed the horse, which had initially been suspicious of her the way horses are suspicious of nervous people, until the animal realized she wasn't nervous anymore and accepted her with the pragmatic equanimity of a well-trained working horse. She also studied the terrain around the cabin with a thoroughness that Elias had to guide her through, pointing out from the front window the natural choke points on the trail, the rock formations that offered cover and those that didn't, the angles from which a rifleman would have clear shots at the yard versus those that would be obstructed. "You're teaching me how to fight," she said on the second day, watching him trace a map of the terrain he'd scratched into a piece of flat board. "I'm teaching you how not to die," Elias corrected. "Different thing." "Is it?" "Fighting means you're already in trouble. Not dying means you planned well enough to avoid the worst of it. I'd rather we never have to fire another shot. But if we do, then we do it from positions where the odds favor us instead of them." She studied the map. "The trail comes up from the left, through those pines. If they come in force, they'll have to come single file through there. That's a choke point." "Yes. But once they're through, the yard opens up and they have space to spread out." "Right. So if there's going to be a confrontation, we want it in the trees, not the yard. How do we make that happen?" Elias looked at her. "By making sure the yard looks more defensible than the tree line. People move toward what looks like safety and away from what looks like threat. If the cabin looks locked down and dangerous, they'll pause in the trees before coming into the open. That pause is what we want. Mara thought about it, head tilted, working it through. So we want them cautious, not bold. A cautious man waits for the right moment and sometimes decides the right moment isn't coming. A bold man charges in and forces your hand. And Briggs? Briggs is methodical. He won't rush. He'll want to make sure before he commits. Elias shifted in the chair, trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on his shoulder. That's actually harder to deal with than a bold man. Bold men make mistakes. Methodical men make fewer. So what do? We wait, we prepare, and we hope he decides the trouble isn't worth it. You don't believe he will. No, but I've been wrong before. On the fourth day, Elias tried to go out and split firewood himself, and made it through exactly 6 swings before Mara appeared behind him, took the axe out of his hand without asking, and kept splitting. I told you I needed to start using it, he said, and I told you 2 more days at minimum. You're going to tear those stitches open. If you say, I've had worse one more time, Elias, I will hit you with this axe. He stopped talking and went back inside. But while he'd been standing in the yard those few minutes, he'd noticed something that had nothing to do with firewood. The snow around the cabin was different, less pristine. Tracks on the lower trail that weren't there yesterday, partially filled in by overnight snowfall, but still readable to someone who knew what to look for. He went to the window and studied the tree line. Mara. He kept his voice even. What? She kept swinging, back turned. Come inside. Something in his tone got through. She set the axe against the woodpile and walked to the cabin without running, which was the right instinct. Running would tell anyone watching that they'd been spotted. She came in and he pointed at the tracks through the window. She looked, then looked at him. How long ago? Last night sometime. One person. Came close enough to see the cabin, then went back down. Briggs, scouting. Or someone he sent. So he's coming. Soon. He knows the layout now. He'll plan around it. Elias turned from the window. We need to decide something. What? Whether we stay or go. Mara stared at him. Go where? I have a contact in Durango. Man who owes me a favor. We could make it in 3 days if we pushed hard, even in this snow. Get off the mountain. Get somewhere with people. Make it harder for Briggs to act without witnesses. She was quiet, thinking it through. He could see the reasoning running across her face. The pros, the cons, the variables. Your shoulder? She said. I can ride. For 3 days in winter conditions? If I have to. That's not an answer. She turned to the window, looking at the tree line. If we run, he chases. And we're in the open, in bad terrain, with you half functional. Here we have walls and position and supplies. Here we're also isolated, no help coming. There's no help coming either way. She turned back to him. I don't want to run, Elias. I've been running my whole life. I'm tired of it. He understood that. He also understood that tired of running wasn't the same as strategically sound, and that being tired of something that had kept you alive so far was a dangerous luxury. Then we make the cabin as hard to take as possible, he said, and we don't wait to be surprised a second time. They spent the rest of that day in preparation that was thorough and unglamorous and exhausting. Elias directed from inside, his shoulder restricting him to tasks that didn't require lifting, while Mara did the physical work. They reinforced the door with additional timber. They positioned the second rifle, freshly cleaned and loaded, where it could cover the left window. They moved supplies to positions that would be accessible in the dark without knowing where anything was. Mara found 2 extra boxes of ammunition in the supply chest under the floorboards. She brought them out and stacked them on the table with the methodical calm of someone making an accounting of resources. Is this enough? She asked. Should be. If it's not, we have bigger problems than ammunition. Meaning more men than we can handle. Meaning more men than we can handle, he confirmed. If it comes to that, we have one other option. Which is? The back wall. There's a gap in the chinking near the floor on the north side. I never got around to fixing it. In an emergency, it's big enough to squeeze through. Mara looked at the north wall. Into the snow. Yes. Horses in the lean-to. If we had to, we could get out that way without going through the yard. That's our last option, she said. That's our last option, he agreed. We don't take it unless everything else has gone wrong. She nodded once and went back to work. That evening was quieter than the previous ones had been. A specific kind of quiet that comes from two people who've said most of what needs saying and are now simply existing in the same space. Elias sat at the table cleaning and rechecking the revolvers, both of them, his and the one Mara had claimed as her own after what happened in the yard. She sat across from him doing the same thing he'd shown her methodical and careful, checking the cylinder, wiping down the barrel. She'd become a different woman than the one he'd brought up the mountain. He could see it most clearly in small things. The way she sat, no longer folded in on herself like she was trying to take up less space. The way she looked at things directly. The way she didn't flinch at sudden sounds anymore, but instead went still and listened, which was different, assessment instead of fear. "Tell me about Clara," she said without looking up from the revolver. Elias stopped what he was doing. "Why?" Because you never talk about her beyond the facts, and I think you need to." "That's assuming a lot." "Maybe." She set the revolver down and looked at him. "But you told me about your father. You told me about coming to the mountain. You talk around her, but not about her. And she's still in this room, Elias. I can feel her. She deserves more than the edges." He was quiet for a while. The fire needed a log, and he got up and fed it one-handed, buying time, organizing thoughts he hadn't needed to organize in years. "She was from Virginia originally," he said finally, sitting back down. "Her family had money before the war, not much left after. She came west with her brother looking for a new start. He found it, or a version of it. She married me instead." A pause. "I don't know what she saw in me. She was better than me, smarter, kinder, knew how to talk to people without putting their backs up. I never had that." "You have it more than you think," Mara said quietly. He shook his head. "I learned to manage. There's a difference. Clara had it naturally. She could walk into a room and make people feel like they were the most important person in it. I used to watch her do it and wonder what it felt like to be built that way." He turned the revolver over in his good hand, looking at nothing in particular. "When she died, it wasn't just grief. It was like losing the version of myself I was when I was with her, the version that was trying to be better. Without her, I just stopped trying." "That's not a permanent condition," Mara said. "It feels like it sometimes." "I know, but it's not." She picked up her revolver again, going back to the cleaning. "I spent 2 years feeling like whatever I'd been before was permanently gone, like the person I was before Samuel died and everything went wrong was just someone who didn't exist anymore. And then I ended up on your floor and you wrapped my feet in medicine and gave me your bed and didn't ask for anything in return. And I started to think maybe what I thought was permanent was just deep." Elias looked at her. "Deep like a wound." "Deep like a root," she said. "Roots look dead in winter. They're not." He didn't answer because the words weren't there. Or maybe they were there, but they were too large to fit through the space in his throat. The night passed slow and watchful, both of them sleeping in short shifts, the other keeping vigil by the window. Elias's shoulder was improving, the deep ache settling from acute to chronic, which his body knew from experience meant healing had genuinely started. He could move his arm with only moderate pain, which was better than yesterday. On the 6th morning, after the fight in the yard, Briggs came back. There were 4 of them this time. Elias saw them from the window in the gray pre-dawn dark shapes moving through the trees at the edge of the yard. He'd been awake, couldn't sleep, some instinct in him running too hot for rest. He touched Mara's shoulder. She was awake instantly, sitting up from her blankets by the fire with her hand already reaching for the revolver. 4, he said quietly. "Tree line left side. They don't know we've seen them." She moved to the window beside him, looking out through the gap between the shutter and the frame. The shapes were barely visible, dark against dark, moving with the careful patience of men who'd planned this. "Briggs?" "Has to be. The others are hired men." "What do they want?" "To burn us out or wait us out. Smoke in the chimney means we're here. They'll wait for us to come out." Mara's jaw tightened. "How long will they wait?" "Long as it takes. They've got supplies, probably. They planned for this." He watched the shapes. "Briggs will position 2 men on the far side of the yard, cutting off the lean-to. 1 on the trail. He'll keep himself somewhere with a clear angle on the door. So we're surrounded." "Not completely. The north wall." She looked at him. "The gap?" "Yes." "You said that was last resort." "This is last resort." A moment of silence. One of the shapes in the trees moved, repositioning, confirming what Elias had predicted about the flanking. If we go through the north wall, Mara said slowly, working it through, we come out behind the cabin. Lean-to is to the right. If one of them is covering the lean-to, we can't get to the horse without crossing open ground. No. So we go on foot. In the dark, before they get fully positioned. We move fast and we move low, and we use the rock formation on the north ridge for cover. From there, we have three options: the high trail, the creek bed going east, or we dig in at the rocks and use the elevation. The rocks give us the high ground. Yes, but we're exposed up there. The creek bed means cover but slower movement. The high trail is fastest but most open. Mara pulled on her coat with quick, practiced movements. How long do we have before they're fully positioned? Elias looked at the tree line. The shapes had stopped moving for now. 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we move now. He went to the north wall and used the hunting knife to work the loose chinking free from around the gap, opening it wider, enough to squeeze through. Cold air poured in, the sharp bite of pre-dawn winter. He went first, working his injured shoulder through carefully, biting down on the pain, dragging himself out into the snow on the north side of the cabin. Then he reached back for Mara. She came through fast and compact, landing beside him in a crouch. She already had the revolver in her hand. He had his rifle slung across his back, the revolver in his hand on the uninjured side. They moved. The snow was deep enough to slow them, but not deep enough to stop them. They used the shadow of the cabin's north wall for the first 30 yards, staying close to the structure, then broke for the rock formation on the north ridge at a run. No stealth about it. Speed was more important now than quiet. Behind them, a shout from the tree line. They'd been spotted. A shot cracked through the dark, wide and high. A warning shot or a bad angle, one of the two. Elias kept running. Another shot, closer this time, chips of rock spraying from a boulder 3 feet to his right. Then Mara went down. Not shot. Her foot broke through a crust of ice over a hollow in the snow, and she went down hard, her leg driving in up to the knee. She was up in seconds, dragging herself free, but those seconds mattered. Elias turned back for her without thinking about it. "Go," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not Elias." Her voice was iron. "I'm fine. Go." He gave her his good arm, pulled her free of the hollow, and they ran together the last 20 yards to the rocks. The first gray light of dawn was starting to bleed into the sky, not enough to see by yet, but coming. They pressed against the cold stone, breathing hard, and took stock. Below them, the cabin was visible, smoke still rising from the chimney. The shapes in the trees had gone still again, recalibrating. Elias counted 4 distinct positions, just as he'd predicted. "Now what?" Mara asked between breaths. "We have the high ground. They want us down. They can try to come up and we make it expensive, or they can wait. Can they burn the cabin from here?" Elias looked at the distance. Too far for a reliable throw. They'd have to send someone across the open yard. We could pick off anyone who tried. "So we have a standoff." "We have a standoff." Mara settled behind a rock that gave her a clear angle on the yard below, checking her revolver, making herself comfortable for a wait. Elias watched her do it and felt something that took him a moment to identify because it had been so long since he'd felt it. Pride. Not the possessive kind, not the condescending kind, the kind that comes from watching someone discover their own capability, from seeing a person decide who they are under real pressure and find out the answer is someone worth being. The standoff lasted 4 hours. The hired men tried twice to cross the yard and were turned back both times by fire from the rocks. Warning shots, not aimed to kill, because Elias had no quarrel with hired men who'd taken on a job without fully understanding what they'd walked into. The second time, one of them caught a ricochet off the stone wall of the cabin and went down holding his arm. He got up and walked, which told Elias it wasn't serious. After the second attempt, there was a long conference in the tree line. Elias watched it from behind the rocks, reading body language from 300 yards away. He'd done this before, read the calculus of men deciding whether the job was worth the cost. "They're talking about leaving," Mara said. "Probably. How can you tell?" "The one on the left, tall man with the gray coat. He's been edging toward the trail since the second attempt. His feet are pointing toward the exit while his body's still turned toward the group. That's a man whose mind is already made up. She looked carefully. I see it. Hired men do the math. Job pays a certain amount. Risk costs a certain amount. When the cost exceeds the pay, they leave. Briggs can't hold them if the numbers don't work. And Briggs himself? Elias found the shape he'd identified as Briggs, thicker through the shoulders than the others, moving with the controlled restraint of someone managing fury. Briggs is different. He's personal about this. But a man alone can't take a defended high position. 10 minutes later, the four shapes began to move toward the trail. Not running, walking, with the dignity of men choosing to leave rather than being driven out. It was an important distinction to them, Elias knew. How you left a thing mattered, even when leaving was the only rational choice. Briggs went last. He stood at the edge of the tree line for a long moment, and though Elias couldn't see his face from this distance, he could feel the weight of the man's attention fixed on the rocks above. Then he turned and walked down the trail, and the mountain swallowed him. They stayed in the rocks for another hour, making sure before coming down. The cabin was undamaged. The fire had burned low, but not out. Elias's coffee was cold on the table where he'd left it. Mara looked around the cabin like she was checking every corner of it, making sure it was still itself. Then she sat down at the table and put her head in her hands, not crying, just still for a moment, letting the weight of the last 4 hours settle through her. Elias built the fire back up. He made fresh coffee, moving slowly and carefully with his shoulder. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. He'll be back, she said into her hands. Maybe. She lifted her head. You don't believe that either. No, he admitted. He'll come back. Not today. Maybe not this month. But men like Briggs don't finish their accounting easily. So what do we do? This was the question he'd been sitting with since the moment he watched Briggs disappear down the trail. He'd been turning it over, looking at all the sides of it, trying to find the answer that made the most sense. We can't live the way we've been living, he said. Not anymore. Two people isolated on a mountain, waiting for the next time someone decides to climb up and test us. That's not sustainable. Then we go to Durango, Mara said. Your contact. Not just Durango, there's a marshal operates out of Durango. Good man, fair. If we can get Briggs on record, what happened here, what he and Rufus did, we change the legal territory. Right now we're two people on a mountain with a dead body in the snow and a story. That's vulnerable. With legal standing, we're something else. And Rufus's death? Self-defense. Witnessed by me. I'll testify to it without hesitation. Mara was quiet for a moment. Will they believe us? A mountain trapper and a woman who was sold for $20. I have 20 years of clean reputation in this territory. It counts for something. He paused. And you're not what you were when you arrived here. Whatever judge or marshal meets you is going to meet someone different from who Rufus pulled into that trading post. She considered this, turning the coffee cup between her palms. When do we leave? Soon, when the weather gives us a window. Your leg. How is it from the fall? Sore. Nothing broken. You're sure? I know what broken feels like. This is just bruised. She stretched the leg experimentally, grimaced. I'll be fine to ride in a day or two. Elias nodded. Outside, the mountain was quiet, the standoff finished, the yard empty and white. The day was moving toward noon, the sun actually showing itself for once, weak and pale, but present. He thought about the next week. The ride to Durango, his shoulder still healing, both of them exposed on open trails. The meeting with the marshal, the story told and retold and picked apart. The legal weight of a woman who'd been sold and a man who'd killed to protect her and then nearly died at the hands of the dead man's partner. All of it tangled and messy and nothing like simple. He thought about Clara, about the years on this mountain, about the morning he'd walked into McCready's trading post just to buy supplies. I owe you something, Mara said suddenly. He looked at her. What? The truth, the full truth, not the pieces I've given you. She set the coffee cup down. You've trusted me with your life. I've trusted you with mine. I think you should know everything. You don't owe me. I know I don't owe you. That's not why I'm saying it. She met his eyes directly. I want to tell you, because you're the first person in a very long time who's given me the space to be honest, and I don't want to waste that. Elias set down his own cup, leaned back carefully against the chair. All right, he said. Tell me. And she did. She told him everything. The parts she'd left out before, the full shape of the story rather than the outline she'd offered in earlier pieces. About Ohio and the family that had never been kind, just distant. About Samuel, who'd been better than what came after, but not as good as what she'd deserved. About Leadville, in more detail than she'd shared before, her voice flat and steady and refusing to look away from what it was. About the months between Leadville and Black Hollow, things she'd done to survive, choices that hadn't been clean. About the version of herself she'd tried to bury because it was easier than living with the memories. Elias listened to all of it without interruption. He didn't recoil at the hard parts. He didn't offer comfort that minimized what she was telling him. He just listened, the way he'd wished someone had listened to him once, a long time ago. When she finished, the cabin was very quiet. "Thank you," he said. She blinked. "For what? For trusting me with it? That's all you're going to say? What else should I say? It doesn't change anything about who you are now. The things that happened to you, the things you did to survive, those are part of your story, not the whole of it. And your story isn't finished." Mara looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she'd read it that very first night, searching for the lie, looking for the place where this cracked. It didn't crack. She picked up her coffee again. "I don't know what to do with you, Elias Crow. Nobody has ever figured that out, including me." He reached across the table with his good arm and wrapped his hand around hers on the cup. Not romantic, not possessive, just present, grounded. One person telling another person they weren't carrying this alone. "We'll figure out Durango together, we'll figure out Briggs together, and after that we figure out whatever comes next," she said. "One thing at a time," he agreed. She turned her hand over beneath his and held it. Outside, the weak winter sun moved across the sky. Indifferent and cold, but there. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. Somewhere far below, the valley held its breath under snow. Two broken people sat at a cabin table in the high country, holding hands across a cup of cold coffee, both of them understanding without saying it that something fundamental had completed itself here. Not finished, not resolved, but arrived at a place that felt like solid ground for the first time. The mountain had tried to take them both in a dozen different ways. Cold, violence, isolation, the particular cruelty of men who believed that other people existed to serve their needs. It hadn't managed it. They were still here, both of them, scarred and tired and not remotely done with the difficulty ahead, but still here. And that, for now, was everything. They left for Durango 4 days later when the weather gave them a window that wasn't generous but was workable. A gap between storms that Elias read from the sky the way other men read newspapers, by patterns and signs accumulated over years of living close enough to the mountain to understand its moods. The morning they left, Mara stood outside the cabin door for a long moment before mounting up. She looked at the yard, at the woodpile, at the place in the snow where Rufus Kane had fallen, and where the evidence of that had since been covered by new snowfall. She looked at the cabin itself, the stone walls, the single window, the smoke rising thin and gray from the chimney where the fire still burned because neither of them had wanted to let it go out entirely. "You all right?" Elias asked from the saddle. "Just looking. We're coming back." She turned and looked at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She mounted behind him, the same position as that first ride through the blizzard 2 months ago, except everything was different now. Her arms around his waist were the arms of someone who'd chosen to hold on, not someone who was holding on because there was nothing else to grip. The trail down was treacherous with ice and new snow, the horse picking its way carefully through sections that had frozen and thawed and frozen again in the weeks since they'd last been on it. Elias's shoulder held, aching steadily but not breaking down, the stitches Mara had put in doing their job. They didn't talk much on the descent. There wasn't much to say that hadn't been said, and the trail required attention. Twice the horse nearly lost footing on steep sections, and both times Elias corrected it with the easy, automatic skill of a man who'd been riding these mountains most of his adult life. The third time, on a switchback above a drop that didn't need examining too closely, Mara tightened her hold around his waist, and he felt her face press briefly against his back. He didn't say anything, neither did she. They reached the lower country by midday and made camp that night in the shelter of a rock overhang that Elias knew from years of moving through this country. It was cold and cramped, and they ate jerky and hardtack because building a fire would take time they'd lose in the morning. They split the watch through the night, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, not because either of them had evidence of pursuit, but because neither of them was willing to bet on the absence of it. Briggs was still out there somewhere. That fact sat between them like a third person on the trail. On the second day, they reached the lower foothills where the snow thinned and the trail widened and the sky opened up in a way that felt almost aggressive after weeks of mountain cabin closeness. Elias could feel Mara taking it in from behind him, the way her posture shifted when the horizon expanded, something releasing in her that had been held tight. "Bigger than I remembered," she said. "The world?" "Yes." A pause. "I'd gotten used to the cabin being everything. Does that bother you?" She thought about it seriously. "No, it means the cabin was enough. That's different from the world being too big." He considered that. There was something true in it that he'd been working around the edges of for years without finding the center of. The world wasn't the problem. He'd made it the problem because he'd needed somewhere to put the grief. The mountain hadn't healed him. It had just given him a place to wait. On the afternoon of the third day, Durango appeared in the distance, spread along a river valley with the casual permanence of a town that had decided it was staying. Elias had been here dozens of times over the years for supplies, for the occasional legal matter, for the particular kind of human contact that he could tolerate in small doses before needing to retreat back to the altitude. He'd never arrived with someone beside him. The difference was specific and noticeable, and he didn't entirely know what to do with it. They rode into town in the late afternoon light, and the first thing Elias did was find the marshal's office. Marshal Dale Hurst was a broad man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be neither surprised nor particularly impressed by any specific example of it. He'd known Elias by reputation for years and by occasional direct contact. Twice Elias had come to him with information about criminal activity in the high country, and twice Hurst had acted on it. They had an understanding based not on warmth, but on mutual recognition of each other's basic reliability. Hurst looked at Mara when they came in, and his face did the thing experienced lawmen's faces do when they're assessing a situation, taking in information without committing to a reaction until they had enough of it. "Crow," he said. "Been a while." "Marshal." "Who's this?" "Mara Vale." "She's why I'm here." They told it straight and plain, seated across from Hurst's desk, Elias letting Mara carry most of the narrative because it was her story more than his, and because he had a feeling Hurst needed to hear it from her directly to understand the full shape of what had happened. She told it without drama and without minimizing, the flat factual recitation of events that carried more weight than any embellishment would have. The trading post, Rufus Kane, the cabin, the fight in the yard, Rufus's death, Briggs and his hired men on the ridge. Hurst listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on paper in front of him, his face unreadable. When she finished, the office was quiet except for the sound of the street outside and the scratch of Hurst's pen finishing a note. "You killed Rufus Kane," Hurst said to Mara. Not accusatory, clarifying. "Yes." "While he was in the process of attacking Elias with a firearm." His partner Briggs had already shot Elias. "Yes." Hurst looked at Elias. "That the account?" "Word for word," Elias said. Hurst set his pen down. "Cutter Briggs, I know. He's been on the edges of criminal activity in this territory for years. Never enough to pin down clean. This gives me more to work with." He looked at Mara again. "You understand there may be a hearing. Formal questions." "I understand," Mara said. "And you're prepared to answer them." "I'm prepared to answer anything." Hurst studied her for a moment with those experienced eyes. Whatever he saw, it satisfied something. "All right, I'll need written statements from both of you. Take a room at the Calloway house. It's clean, and the owner is a reasonable woman. Stay in town until I tell you otherwise. I'll send word when I need you." They gave the written statements that afternoon, Elias's hand cramped around the pen, Mara writing hers with the careful deliberateness of someone who taught herself to read and write in difficult circumstances and didn't take the ability for granted. Then they took rooms at the Calloway house as instructed, 2 rooms, which required no discussion, and Elias ate the first meal he hadn't cooked himself in 2 months and tasted almost nothing because his mind was running too many calculations at once. He sat in the small dining room of the boarding house alone after Mara had gone upstairs. nursing a cup of coffee and thinking about Briggs, about how long Hearst's investigation would take, about the cabin sitting empty on the mountain with the fire gone cold now, about what came after legal proceedings that might stretch weeks or longer, about what came after everything, which was the question he'd been not quite looking at for some time now. Mara came back downstairs an hour later. She'd changed into clothes that fit her. She'd found a dry goods store on the way to the boarding house and spent 40 minutes in it with the coins Elias had lent her, emerging with practical things: a coat that fit, a shirt, a pair of sturdy boots that didn't fall off her feet. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't quite managed in his oversized clothing. She sat across from him and accepted a cup of coffee from the boarding house keeper. "Hearst believes us," she said. "He does. How long does this take?" "His part, maybe 2 weeks. Longer if he has to chase Briggs down, which he probably will." "And Briggs?" "If Hearst catches him, he goes before a judge. If he doesn't," Elias turned the coffee cup, "then we go back to the mountain and we stay ready. But I don't think it comes to that. Hearst is good at his job." Mara looked out the window at the Durango street, at the people moving past in the cold afternoon, at the normalcy of a functioning town going about its business. Something in her expression was complicated, not quite longing and not quite discomfort, more like looking at a language she'd once spoken fluently and was now finding she'd only partially forgotten. "I haven't been in a town properly since Leadville," she said. "It feels strange." "Strange good or strange bad?" "Just strange. Loud. A lot of faces." She watched a group of women pass on the boardwalk outside, talking to each other with the ease of people who'd known each other long enough to run out of interesting things to say, and had moved on to the comfortable territory of ordinary things. "I used to want this. A town, people, the regular shape of a life. Before Samuel died, that's all I wanted. And now?" She turned from the window. "Now I want something else. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like yet, but it includes the mountain." Elias looked at her. "The cabin." "Yes." "Why?" She seemed to consider the question seriously, the way she did with most things now, not reaching for the first available answer, but actually examining what she believed before she said it. "Because it's the first place I chose to be," she said finally. "I didn't end up there by accident or by force, or because I had nowhere else. I stayed because I wanted to. That makes it mine in a way nothing else has ever been." The words settled over Elias like something he'd been waiting to hear without knowing he was waiting. He didn't respond immediately. Some things deserve the respect of silence before the response. "Then we go back," he said. "Together," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact, offered the same way she'd said all right when he'd admitted he needed help with the outside work. Casual and complete, and carrying enormous weight in the simplest possible words. Hearst moved faster than Elias had expected. On the 6th day in Durango, word came that Briggs had been located in a mining camp 20 miles east, attempting to recruit additional men for what he'd apparently been describing as an unresolved business matter. The description was so precisely Briggs, the bureaucratic language wrapped around violent intent, that Elias almost wanted to be surprised by it. He wasn't. Hearst rode out with 2 deputies and returned 3 days later with Briggs in custody, angrier than any man Elias had seen in a long time, which was information in itself. Fury at that level came from believing you had a right to something that was being denied you. Briggs had convinced himself he was the wronged party. Some men were capable of that revision and some weren't, and the ones who could do it were the most dangerous kind because they believed their violence was justice. The formal hearing took place in a low-ceilinged room attached to the marshal's office, with a circuit judge named Ambrose Harker, who'd come through on his regular rotation and had the look of a man who'd heard everything twice and was waiting to be shown something genuinely new. Mara testified for 40 minutes, answering every question in the same direct, unembellished way she'd told it to Hearst. She didn't perform distress, and she didn't perform strength. She just told what happened in the order it happened. Elias watched the judge's face while she spoke, and saw the moment when Harker stopped treating it as a routine account and started actually listening. Elias testified after her, corroborating everything, filling in the physical details from the fight in the yard. The angles, the distances, the sequence of shots, his own injury. He'd spent enough time with enough hard men to know how to speak in a way that carried the weight of experience, and Harker received it as such. Briggs's lawyer was a young man who was good at his job but had been handed a difficult position. He tried to establish that the events in the cabin yard had been a legitimate business dispute. Harker stopped him at the word legitimate with a look that communicated, without requiring words, that characterizing the attempted armed robbery of a wounded man and the recapture of a woman who had never been property to begin with as a business dispute was an approach the judge was not going to entertain. The outcome wasn't immediate. Nothing in law was, but it was clear before they walked out of that room which direction it was going. Hearst confirmed it 2 days later over coffee in his office. Briggs is going to trial for attempted murder, he said. Yours specifically, Crow, since that's the cleanest charge. The woman's situation complicates things. The law in this territory on that matter is, he paused, choosing words carefully, not as clear as it ought to be. But with Rufus Kane dead and Briggs going to trial, there's no one left with any legal claim on anything regarding Miss Vale, if there ever was one. There never was, Elias said. No, Hearst agreed. There never was. He looked at both of them and then did something Elias hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a tired, genuine expression that was as close to emotion as Elias had ever seen on the man's face. You two did right, he said, in a situation where most people would have done otherwise. I want you to know I see that. Mara accepted it with a nod. Elias said nothing because nothing was needed. They left Durango on a Thursday morning when the weather had turned toward something almost charitable, the temperature above freezing for the first time in months. The sky a clear, deep blue that felt like a promise the mountain was making without any intention of keeping it for long. On the way back up, they stopped in Black Hollow. Elias hadn't planned on it, but Mara had asked quietly, the night before they left Durango, whether they could go through town on the way back. He'd asked why, and she'd said she needed to see it. He hadn't pushed further. Now they rode into Black Hollow in the early afternoon, and the town looked exactly as it always had. A collection of rough buildings, muddy streets, men moving between the trading post and the saloon, and the assay office in the rotation that defined frontier commerce. The mountains behind it were brilliant with snow in the clear light. McCready's trading post was exactly where it had been. Elias tied the horse to the rail, and they went in. The interior smelled the same, tobacco and unwashed wool and the particular sweetness of the wood stove. There were maybe a dozen men inside, a different configuration than before, but the same types, the same postures. The silence that fell when they walked in was recognizable to Elias as the silence of a room registering information and deciding what to do with it. He'd heard it 100 times. He ignored it and moved to the supply counter and began placing his order, the powder and salt and lamp oil he'd left behind 2 months ago, plus additional items for 2 people through the remainder of winter. Behind him, he was aware of the room's attention moving between him and Mara, and of the specific quality of that attention, the way it was doing the calculation of who she was and what her presence meant, and how that fit against whatever stories had circulated about what had happened on the mountain. Stories had circulated, he was certain of that. Small towns ran on stories, and a mountain man who'd thrown $20 into the dirt and left with a woman who'd been for sale was the kind of story that circulated and grew as it went. He didn't care. The clerk, the same one who had watched Elias leave his supplies on this counter 2 months ago and said nothing, began filling the order without comment. Elias counted out coins, not the same wallet as before because Durango had cost money, but enough. They weren't flush, but they weren't broke either. Mara moved through the trading post with the calm deliberateness of someone who knew exactly where she was and had decided what it meant to her. She examined the shelves, selected a few small things, thread, needles, a small book that she turned over in her hands before deciding to buy, and brought them to the counter. A man near the stove said something low to the man beside him. Elias didn't hear the words, but he saw Mara hear them, saw the slight straightening of her spine, the moment of choice. She turned and looked at the man directly. Just looked at him. Nothing aggressive, nothing theatrical. Just the level, unflinching gaze of a woman who'd been through things that made whatever this man's opinion amounted to feel like exactly what it was, nothing at all. The man looked away first. Elias watched this happen and felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for a long time. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Something closer to the feeling you get when a thing that was wrong for a long time finally rights itself. They loaded the supplies onto the horse in the cold afternoon and rode out of Black Hollow without looking back. The mountain trail was different in the returning light. Familiar in the way of a place you know well enough to have opinions about it. This turn is always icy. This section collects wind. This stretch opens onto a view that is worth the climb even when everything else is miserable. Elias had ridden this trail so many times it was written into his body, into the automatic corrections he made without thinking about them, the places he knew to slow, and the places where it was safe to move faster. He thought about the first ride, Mara pressed against his back, shaking with cold and braced for harm. That flat one-word voice answering his questions. Yes. No. I don't know. Her life reduced to survival responses, the full vocabulary of herself packed away because there had been no safe place to use it. Behind him now, she pointed out a hawk circling above the eastern ridge and said it looked like it was complaining about the weather, and he agreed that it did, and they had a small back and forth about whether hawks complained in general or whether this was a specific hawk with a particular grievance, and it was such an ordinary, ridiculous conversation to be having on a mountain trail in early spring that Elias had to consciously decide not to ruin it by noting how remarkable it was. The cabin appeared through the trees in the late afternoon, exactly as they'd left it. Cold, the fire long dead, a thin crust of new snow on the roof from a storm that had come through in their absence. The lean-to was undisturbed, which meant no one had been near the place. The door was still latched. Mara got down from the horse before he did, moving with the ease of someone who'd learned to ride properly over the past weeks, rather than just hold on. She walked to the cabin door, opened it, and stood in the doorway looking at the cold interior. Elias unsaddled the horse and got it settled in the lean-to. When he came in, Mara had already started building the fire. Not from a need to prove herself, not from a reflex to be useful before being punished for existing, just because the fire needed starting and she was the one standing next to it. He helped her, and they had it going in 10 minutes, the familiar sound of it filling the cabin, the warmth beginning its slow reclamation of the cold space. They unpacked the supplies in easy companionship, finding the places for things, the system they'd developed without formally creating it. His things here, her things there, shared things in the middle, which was a better arrangement than either of them had articulated, but both of them had arrived at. That evening, sitting across the fire with the mountain sealed around them and winter still making its presence known outside, Mara said something that had been forming for a long time. I want to do something with this place. Elias looked at her. What kind of something? The mountain. How many people come through struggling? Trappers caught by weather. Prospectors who've run out of supplies. Settlers who've made bad decisions about timing and geography. She leaned forward in her chair. I've thought about it since Durango. We're positioned at an elevation that catches people on the way up or down. We have space. We have skills between us. We know the territory. What if this wasn't just a place to hide from the world? What if it was a place to help people in it? Elias considered this. The idea arrived in his mind, and he turned it, looking at the different sides. His first instinct was refusal. More people meant more complexity, more need, more of exactly what he'd retreated up here to avoid. He recognized that instinct and noted it and looked past it to see what was actually there. What was actually there was Mara, who had been broken by a world that refused to offer grace and had rebuilt herself in a cabin on a mountain that had offered it, and was now proposing to extend that same thing outward. It wasn't naive. She wasn't proposing charity for the sake of it. She was proposing a practical operation, something with structure and purpose. A trading post, he said slowly. Shelter. Supplies for people coming through. Yes. Not free. We couldn't sustain free. But fair. Priced for what people in trouble can actually manage, not what they can be bled for. She paused. I know what it is to need help and find nothing but people who want to profit from desperation. That's not what I want to do. It's a lot of work. The cabin would need expansion. You build. I've watched you enough to learn the basics. We could do it before next winter. We'd need a supply line, regular runs to Black Hollow or Durango. We'd establish one. And the people who come through. Not all of them are good people. Some of them will be exactly the type that's already given us trouble. Yes, she said, without flinching. And we handle those the way we've handled everything else. He looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had arrived on his mountain with nothing and had built something from it. Not just for herself, but now reaching beyond herself. taking what she'd learned from being helped and wanting to make it available to others. It wasn't nobility, it wasn't sainthood. It was something more specific and more human, someone who'd been shown that grace was possible and who had decided to believe in it enough to offer it. "All right," he said. She blinked. "That's it? All right? What did you want? A negotiation?" I expected more resistance. "I've spent 8 years on this mountain being resistant," Elias said. "I'm tired of it." He shifted in his chair, feeling the shoulder which was still there, still healing, still his to carry. "Besides, you're not wrong. About the position, the resources. It makes practical sense. It makes human sense," Mara said. "Practical is secondary. Human sense is harder to argue with," he agreed. They began in spring. The snow receded from the lower slopes in stages, revealing the mud and rock underneath, the mountain reluctantly returning color to a world it had kept under white for too long. Elias started on the expansion of the cabin in March, adding a second room off the east wall that would serve as shelter for travelers, and Mara worked alongside him with the competent persistence of someone who'd decided she was going to learn a thing and had the stubbornness to see it through. She was not naturally skilled at construction. She made mistakes, the kind that required tearing work out and starting over, the kind that Elias corrected without comment because correction was the thing the situation needed, not the elaboration of the error. She got better. Not fast, but steadily. By the time they were putting up the second room's roof, she was doing work that needed no correction. They argued about things, not about whether to do them, but how. The angles of construction, the placement of a storage shelf, the best approach to a particular supply run. The arguments were functional and real and occasionally stubborn on both sides, and they always reached conclusions, and afterward neither of them held the disagreement against the other. It was nothing like perfect. Elias's shoulder gave him trouble through the cold weeks, and he was shorter-tempered on those days than he wanted to be. Mara went through stretches where the old silence descended on her, the retreat into herself that he'd learned to recognize and give space to without taking personally, though sometimes that was harder than it sounded. They were two people with long histories of damage living in close quarters on a mountain, and damage didn't disappear just because circumstances improved. But they were trying. That was the actual thing. Not trying to be good enough for each other's standards, but trying to understand each other accurately and make space for what they found, which is a harder and more specific effort than the version that sounds like a story. The first travelers came through in April, two men who'd been caught by a late storm on the high trail and who arrived at the cabin in the condition Mara had described. Supplies gone, cold damaged, calculating what they could barter. She dealt with them directly, naming prices that were fair and firm, and the men accepted them with the relief of people who'd expected to be bled and had instead been treated as humans. They left the next morning, and 2 days later, two more arrived. A woman alone with a mule and a load of goods she was moving between towns, who'd heard from the first two men that there was shelter and fair dealing at the Crow cabin above Black Hollow. "Word travels," Mara said that evening. "Fast," Elias agreed. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it. Once, it would have been. Once, any increase in human traffic through his mountain would have been cause for serious reconsideration of where he was living. He looked around the expanded cabin, at the second room where the traveling woman was sleeping, at the supplies stacked and organized and available, at Mara across the table from him, with ink on her hand from the ledger she'd started keeping. "No," he said, "not a problem." Briggs went to trial in May. Elias and Mara made the ride to Durango for it and sat in the courtroom and testified again, the same words they'd given before, offered with the same plainness. The jury took 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on the attempted murder charge, and the judge sentenced Briggs to 8 years in the territorial prison at Canyon City. When they walked out of the courthouse into the May sunlight, Elias stopped on the steps and just stood there for a moment. Mara stood beside him, and they both looked at the mountains in the distance, white still on the high peaks, green starting below. "It's over," she said. "That part of it," Elias said. "Yes." She looked at him. "What's left?" He turned to look at her, this woman who'd arrived on his mountain in the worst storm of the year with nothing but bruises and emptiness and a flat survival voice, who'd grown into someone he didn't have adequate words for. Someone who made good coffee now and still couldn't make a decent biscuit, but kept trying. Someone who read in the evenings and asked him questions about things she'd read and argued with his answers when she disagreed. Someone who'd killed a man to save his life and never asked him to make her feel different about it. The rest of it, he said, whatever that turns out to be. She smiled then. A real one, the kind that involved her whole face and that she hadn't had when she arrived because it had been beaten out of her, the kind that she was only now slowly reclaiming. It wasn't a perfect smile. Her face carried the evidence of what she'd been through and always would, but it was real, which was better than perfect. I can work with that, she said. The summer that followed was the hardest Elias had worked in years, and also, in some accounting that didn't fit neatly into language, the best. The trading lodge, which is what travelers began calling it, the name spreading down the mountain ahead of them and arriving back to them secondhand, developed its own small reputation in the territory. Not famous, not large, but known. A place on the high trail where fair dealing was the rule and shelter was available if you needed it and could pay a reasonable price. Word did reach Black Hollow eventually, and it reached Black Hollow in the specific way that news reaches a small town, through the people who'd used the lodge and said so. There was no moment of reckoning, no confrontation with the men who'd laughed at Mara's suffering in McCready's trading post, just the slow, quiet revision of a narrative. The way people's understanding of things shifts when the evidence accumulates in a direction that contradicts what they'd assumed. A few people who'd been in that trading post on that particular afternoon passed through the lodge over the course of that summer. Most said nothing. One man, a trapper who'd laughed louder than the others that day, Elias was almost certain, accepted shelter during a storm and paid the price Mara named and said quietly, before he left the next morning, that he was glad she was all right. She thanked him without drama and sent him down the trail with a package of jerky he hadn't paid for. Elias watched this from the doorway. You didn't have to do that. No, she agreed. I didn't. Why did you? She considered it. Because carrying what those people did to me is heavier than letting it go. And because I get to decide what kind of person I am. The fact that they were wrong about me doesn't mean I have to become wrong about everything in return. Elias had no answer for that. He went back inside and did the things that needed doing, turning her words over in his head for the rest of the day. What he came to eventually was something he'd been approaching from the edges of for a long time without finding the center of. He'd come to the mountain to escape the world because the world had given him grief, and he hadn't known what else to do with it. That was the truth. Not noble, not strategic, just a man running from pain and calling it solitude. What the mountain had actually given him wasn't escape. It had given him distance enough to see things clearly. And when Mara had arrived, or rather, when he'd made the decision that changed both their lives in the dirt-floored trading post of a freezing frontier town, what had come with her was the slow, difficult return to the question of what he was actually here for, not surviving. That was easy. He'd gotten very good at surviving, being alive, which was different, which required other people, required risk, required the specific vulnerability of caring whether something continued. He'd known Clara taught him that, and he'd forgotten it for 8 years. Mara reminded him of it, not by being Clara, not by replacing anything that had been lost, but by being so thoroughly, specifically herself, that there was no room left for the substitution. She was her own argument for why the world was worth staying in. On a late summer evening, they sat outside the cabin on the bench Elias had built against the south wall, which caught the last of the day's sun and held the warmth longer than anywhere else on the property. Below them, the valley was gold and green in the evening light, the river catching the sun in bright flashes. The mountains on the far side were violet in the long shadows. Elias had been carrying something for weeks. He'd been waiting for the right moment, then stopped waiting for the right moment, because moments didn't arrange themselves conveniently. You said things when they needed saying, or they became regrets. I love you, he said. Not the way you say it in the first rush of feeling, when it comes out as a surprise to the speaker. The way you say it when you've known it long enough to have looked at it from all sides and decided it's real. Like a fact you've confirmed. Mara didn't react for a moment. She kept looking at the valley. Then she turned her head and looked at him with that direct reading gaze she had. I know, she said. You know. I've known for a while. I was waiting to see if you were going to say it or decide it was too dangerous. It is too dangerous, he said. Yes. She didn't look away. Most things worth doing are. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had that day across the table in the cabin, grounded and present, one person telling another they weren't alone. Except this time she turned her hand over and held back, not with resignation or gratitude, but with the full and voluntary weight of someone who'd chosen exactly where they were. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. Since somewhere around the 3rd week, if you want to be specific." The 3rd week. "You fell asleep reading and dropped the book on your own head and didn't wake up. It was very endearing." He stared at her. "You never told me that." "I'm telling you now." He almost said something and then didn't because she was laughing, quietly, genuinely, the kind of laugh that is not performed but simply present, that exists because something is actually funny, and the person laughing is actually happy enough to let the happiness out. He didn't know how to measure what the previous months had been worth in any currency that made sense. $20 had started it. Everything else had cost more than money, more than the accounting of risk and injury and difficulty, the kind of cost that you can only assess in retrospect, and only if you're honest with yourself about what you'd have lost by not paying it. He had a bad shoulder and a rebuilt sense of what it meant to be a person in the world. He had a trading lodge on a mountain that was doing actual good for actual people. He had a woman sitting beside him who had been sold for $20 and had used that $20 as the starting material for rebuilding herself from the ground up, and who had, in the process, rebuilt him whether he'd asked for it or not. The valley below went from gold to amber, to the deep soft purple of mountain dusk. The first stars appeared over the eastern ridge. The mountain was going to be cold tonight, as it always was, as it would always be, beautiful and indifferent, and asking nothing of the people on it. Elias Crow sat on a bench outside his cabin with Maravale's hand in his and watched the dark come in and felt, for the first time in 8 years, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe or simple or free of the difficulty that was simply the permanent condition of being alive and caring about things, but because it was chosen by both of them, every day, again, which was the only way choosing meant anything at all. The night settled over the mountain. Inside, the fire waited. Tomorrow, there would be work, and the day after that, more work, and somewhere in the coming months, the snow would return, and the trails would close, and the world below would become theory again for a while. None of that was a problem. They went inside together and let the dark have the mountain.
The hell is
So
that?
let things have what
No,
they're going
his
to have
dad shot
anyway,
him.
and focused on what was
my
theirs.
God.
The fire.
You didn't know that?
The warmth. The sound of each other breathing in a cabin on a ridge.
Yeah,
above a
he was
world
having
that had
his
tried
dad
its level
was I think it
best
might
to
have been
break them
stepdad
apart.
maybe, but
It hadn't managed.
dad or stepdad was having an
And that,
argument with his
in the
mom
end,
and he got in
was the
between
whole
it and
story.
then they shot him. Bro, the enemy top is Hina boyfriend. What does that even mean?
Based jabroni.
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Jabroni is like a. I don't even know what a jabroni is. I was thinking of like the fucking dudes who like My Little Pony.
Oh, that's just brony.
Yeah, brony.
Didn't you have a friend that was a brony at one point?
Yep.
What was that guy's name?
His name on Xbox was Pinky Rar. His real name's Lucas. I met him in Japan.
It
a
is
goat.
his name. What? I don't understand what Cutthroat is talking about. Who's that, Unk? Gas. I didn't even understand what was happening in his videos. I stayed for Minecraft. Yeah, real shit.
I'm level fucking 9, by the way. Because my fiddlesticks just never.
Damn. Okay. Alright, GG's.
I'm so fed.
If there's Vigo says, or I don't want them. Hina boyfriend. That doesn't make any sense, Cutthroat. Like what?
You should be up there, fiddle dick.